I hope everyone can see the presentation at the moment. Excellent. Okay, so we'll just get started now. So good morning, and thank you for having me this morning to give a talk on why we need critical consciousness development in the higher educational system, and how can anti-racism play a role in bringing about this kind of transformation in our systems. Just to give you a little background about myself, I am a social psychologist by training. I was trained at the University of Nevada, Reno, and the program I was in was an interdisciplinary social psychology program. It was heavy on theory, methodology, as well as sociological and social psychological theories. During my early stint in graduate school, I actually studied psychology and law before shifting into my current passion, which is social psychology and education. As a social psychologist, I actually come from a very specific epistemology that's called critical social science. And in this epistemology, critical social scientists, they tend to study social hierarchies and other unjust social arrangements. As a critical social scientist, I do this work from a critical race theory perspective. And I also look at what are called system justifying discourses. In essence, the type of rhetoric that we as people use in our society in order to keep certain practices in place. I approach this work from a historical perspective, as well as an ecosystemic perspective, which I'll be talking about a little bit. And more importantly, I approach this work from a liberation psychology perspective, which we will be digging into in this hour. Now, I want to extend my gratitude at this moment to the Equitable Calculus for Life Sciences program for giving me the honor of speaking with you today. Now, rather than doing a workshop or a presentation with a bunch of bullet points on it, which is common in my field of work, for the next hour, I would like to take a different approach with all of you. I would like to initiate what will hopefully become an ongoing conversation, a conversation that doesn't conclude with this 1 hour presentation I'll be giving. Now, as a social psychologist, words are very, very fascinating to me. They reveal much about our society and about ourselves. We can think of discourses as the bridge between the psychological world or our mental life and the social world where we all participate. And so discourses being the bridge between these two worlds, they make the sociological and the social possible. Discourses are also projections of our personal values, as well as reflections of the broader cultural worldview, what are referred to as ideologies. And we'll talk about those a little bit. Discourses reveal how we think. And so for this reason, language, again, is a very interesting phenomenon that social psychologists are interested in. But from a critical perspective, discourses reveal much more. Discourses are a form of power. They carry the ability to influence and control individuals and entire groups. In this way, discourses are the arenas where the politics of definition take place. It's the areas where people label things, where we create, recreate, prioritize, and through these words, sometimes we also erase. And this is often done to the advantage of already powerful groups in our society. The politics of definition are not acted upon equally. Of course, most of us are not raised, let alone trained, to recognize the discourses that keep racist practices in place. Nor are we trained to understand how those practices and systems allow for other forms of injustice, whether we're talking about sexism or ageism. So part of creating an equitable culture in the workplace and beyond requires an awareness of the power of discourse. Conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion, they tend to be narrow and very superficial because of this lack of awareness. In fact, there's even a name for this. It's called neoliberal multiculturalism. It's a very, very, again, superficial approach to trying to understand what diversity and equity and inclusion are actually about. For instance, we see it in the ways that we define these concepts. Diversity is often limited to matters of race or gender. Or in the public, we often misuse the words equity and equality, and we treat them as interchangeable concepts. And we also tend to narrow the idea of inclusivity to a mere sense of psychological belongingness. Now, don't get me wrong, psychological belongingness is very important. But this definition does tend to exclude the fact that we may actually leave people outside of the power structure. So diversity, equity, and inclusion, when they are reduced to actions that primarily aim to increase the numbers of underrepresented groups, we do this without considering the forces that will encourage their assimilation into an already pre-existing racist system. When we reduce issues of DEI to individual problems, we tend to ignore how those issues are impacted by problems of practice and institutional culture. So when done incorrectly, DEI actions eschew opportunities to challenge longstanding and historically ingrained social injustices. DEI actions that follow this neoliberal approach, what's colloquially referred to as the heroes and holidays approach. It tends to place an emphasis on celebrating the lives of exceptional people from specific social groups or celebrating a culture's traditions. Now, the tendency to celebrate in and of itself is not a bad thing, but the tendency to celebrate while doing nothing else, it does run a risk. It may reinforce stereotypes by treating all members of a group as a monolith. It may also elevate a rosy picture or a mythology about a culture that at the same time denies the harsh realities of that culture's past and present conditions. The heroes and holidays approach amounts to performance rather than an intentional set of social change actions. It may generate a personal sense of satisfaction, as social justice work should do, but it may not necessarily generate institutional solutions. One way to avoid the heroes and holidays approach is to appreciate how social justice educators like myself tend to define concepts like diversity, equity, and inclusion. Diversity is not just the representation of certain groups, but also the representation of multiple and intersecting identities, as well as ideas. It is the notion that differences are valued and accepted. Equity, again, is not the same as equality. Equality means to each the same. Equity, on the other hand, is based off of the principle of fairness, to each by need. It means making sure that there are fair opportunities to access resources, to receive fair treatment, to have opportunities to excel. And inclusion, while it is important to foster that sense of belongingness, it's equally important that all individuals have a voice, that they have the ability to exercise power, that they have a role in the decision-making process. So when done correctly, DEI should elevate what the scholar Tara Yoso refers to as the community cultural wealth. It's the knowledge, the skills, the abilities, the contacts and networks that have been possessed and used by minoritized groups to survive and to resist racism and other forms of oppression. Of course, comprehensive definitions alone do not change systems, nor do comprehensive definitions change culture. Neoliberal practices like the heroes and holidays approach, they amount to short-term activities that really do little to transform organizational culture. It's a one and done method that's problematic for various reasons. First, it fails to challenge assimilationism. Again, the heroes and holidays approach will hold up mainstream culture as superior to other cultures. Now, keep in mind that mainstream is code. It means white, male, heterosexual, Christian. The idea of assimilation runs against the notion of diversity. And similarly, the heroes and holidays approach fails to challenge dominant ideologies, these larger worldviews that are a part of our culture. The United States is full of these dominant ideologies, and I can go through a few of them fairly quickly. Color blindness is perhaps one of the biggest. It's the idea that if we simply ignore race, then the problem of racism will simply go away. This is ideal, but in practice, very few problems are ever solved by simply ignoring them. And color blindness also invalidates everyone's racialized experience in a system that is intentionally racist. Colorblindness, again, will promote an assimilation to the mainstream or white culture. And upholding colorblindness is the idea of individualism and meritocracy. The idea that the self is separate from all other individuals and the society. The idea that we value competition over cooperation and that we think that's natural rather than a social construct. The fact that we prefer dominance and authority and hierarchy over egalitarian alternatives. And individualism, again, reduces the structural down to the individual. It goes against these ideas of inclusivity. Colorblindness and individualism will shift focus away from fairness and move it towards concepts like neutrality, objectivity, and equality, which in the abstract are wonderful principles, but in the real have been quite problematic. They've undermined the possibility for long-term planning and strategizing. So creating and sustaining an equitable culture in a structurally racist society is difficult. It requires the co-creation of a long-term vision by all members of an organization. It requires the continual opportunities for self-development, a reduction or elimination of hierarchical arrangements whenever possible, the prioritization of time and space to encourage respectful conversations about racism and other forms of oppression, and the development of egalitarian relationships. So taken together, we can see how creating an equitable culture emerges from four processes. One, exposure to anti-racist knowledge in order to challenge the discourses of our society. Two, a critique of our own culture and a self-reflection about our internalized assumptions and beliefs. Number three, reimagining a reality that doesn't yet exist. And number 4, implementing that vision through teamwork and mentorship. In effect, the transformation of organizations begins with a personal journey of self-liberation, a liberation from the racist ideological discourses that keep our minds captive and unable or perhaps unwilling to work towards authentic DEI aims. Now, liberation psychologists like myself, we approach the study of the human condition from a slightly different standpoint, one that runs counter to the individualistic and Eurocentric approach to mainstream psychology. Now, keep in mind that mainstream psychology has informed much of mainstream society's understanding of human behavior. This goes back to the beginnings in Freudian psychology and the notion of the ego, a disciplinary separation between sociologists and psychologists, a behaviorism movement that sought to reduce the structural to the behavioral, and since the 1960s into the present day, a cognitive revolution and neurocognitive approach that has placed an emphasis on mental processes. Mainstream psychology, in effect, has perpetuated into the dominant culture a false duality, a separation between the individual and the society. Unlike mainstream psychology, however, which focuses on curing individual level problems of living, liberation psychologists like myself contend that the personal is sociological and the sociological is personal. For this reason, it is not possible to remedy personal problems of living without placing them in their proper historical, social, and political contexts. Personal problems of living are not disorders to be treated or circumstances that people deserve. They're better understood as manifestations of socially unaware minds and the environmental conditions that hinder the awareness of people within their society. Applied to the issue of racism, liberation psychologists are studying the dialectical link or the interdependency between individual acts of discrimination and an intergenerational system of white advantage that has been in place for centuries. We are motivated to make all people, whether they're psychologists or regular people out on the streets, we're motivated to make them socially aware of the racist conditions that limit their life opportunities. As a guiding epistemology, liberational perspectives have been powerful tools in my research, especially on social consciousness development. Through this research, I've been able to learn a few things. First, the United States as a hierarchical system has never been invested in achieving racial equality for all. It's by design. Members of both the dominant and subordinate groups, they will co-construct this society and co-justify the status quo. And this is made possible through what are called social structures, the laws, the norms, the policies, and the ideologies in our society that function outside of the control of any one individual or even one interest group. And yet, at the same time, powerful individuals and groups have a vested interest in keeping most people unaware of the society's racially oppressive conditions. So the development of social consciousness can be viewed as a psychological progression that involves 4 aspects, comparable to those aspects that you would need to create an equitable culture. Number 1, it begins with awareness, self-education about historical and systemic racism. Number 2, deconstruction, meaning the ability to self-reflect and to acknowledge one's complicity in a racist system. Number 3, reconstruction, the self-transformation that comes with liberating the self from a race disconscious mind, a mind that is unaware of the existence or severity of racism. And number 4, praxis, the ability to enact those reconstructed values and to put them into play, to live out anti-racist actions. The process of social consciousness development isn't easy, though. It's a difficult and painful process. It entails a lifelong commitment to anti-racism and social justice work. Now, what's interesting is that my research has uncovered parallels between this psychological progression and something that actually comes out of the humanities, the idea of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey.
What do Harry Potter, Katniss Everdeen, and Frodo all have in common with the heroes of ancient myths? What if I told you they are all variants of the same hero? Do you believe that? Joseph Campbell did. He studied myths from all over the world and published a book called The Hero with 1,000 Faces, retelling dozens of stories and explaining how each represents the monomyth or hero's journey. So, what is the hero's journey? Think of it as a cycle. The journey begins and ends in the hero's ordinary world, but the quest passes through an unfamiliar, special world. Along the way, there are some key events. Think about your favorite book or movie. Does it follow this pattern? Status quo, that's where we start. 1 o'clock, call to adventure. The hero receives a mysterious message, an invitation, a challenge. 2 o'clock, assistance. The hero needs some help, probably from someone older, wiser. 3 o'clock, departure. The hero crosses the threshold from his normal, safe home and enters the special world and adventure. We're not in Kansas anymore. 4 o'clock, trials. Being a hero is hard work. Our hero solves a riddle, slays a monster, escapes from a trap. 5 o'clock, approach. It's time to face the biggest ordeal, the hero's worst fear. 6 o'clock, crisis. This is the hero's darkest hour. He faces death and possibly even dies, only to be reborn. 7 o'clock, treasure. As a result, the hero claims some treasure, special recognition, or power. 8 o'clock, result. This can vary between stories. Do the monsters bow down before the hero, or do they chase him as he flees from the special world? 9 o'clock, return. After all that adventure, the hero returns to his ordinary world. 10 o'clock, new life. This quest has changed the hero. He has outgrown his old life. 11 o'clock, resolution. All the tangled plot lines get straightened out. 12 o'clock, status quo, but upgraded to a new level. Nothing is quite the same once you're a hero. Many popular books and movies follow this ancient formula pretty closely, but let's see how well The Hunger Games fits the hero's journey template. When does Katniss Everdeen hear a call to adventure that gets the story moving? When her sister's name is called from the lottery. How about assistance? Is anyone going to help her on her adventure? Hey, Mitch. What about departure? Does she leave her ordinary world? She gets on a train to the capital. Okay, so you get the idea. What do you have in common with Harry Potter, Katniss Everdeen, and Frodo? Well, you're human, just like them. The hero's journey myth exists in all human cultures and keeps getting updated because we humans reflect on our world through symbolic stories of our own lives. You leave your comfort zone, have an experience that transforms you, and then you recover and do it again. You don't literally slay dragons or fight Voldemort, but you face problems just as scary. Joseph Campbell said, "In the cave you fear to enter lies the treasure you seek." What is the symbolic cave you fear to enter? Auditions for the school play? Baseball tryouts? Love? Watch for this formula in books, movies, and TV shows you come across. You will certainly see it again, but also be sensitive to it in your own life. Listen for your call to adventure. Accept the challenge. Conquer your fear and claim the treasure you seek. And then do it all over again.
So comparing Joseph Campbell's idea of the hero's journey and connecting it with our discussion today on social consciousness development, you can see that there are striking similarities. Both concern a personal transformation, one from disconsciousness to consciousness, from a place of detachment of the self and the society to a place of connection. Both also implicate psychological and social dynamics that can either foster or hinder the social consciousness development process. And both the hero's journey and liberation psychology highlight the interdependency between the needs of the individual and the needs of the society. And so if we simply take the 4 aspects of liberation psychology, we can actually impose Joseph Campbell's spiral onto this model. And we can see that a lot of the premises still hold. I tend to replace the word hero with anti-racist. I do not believe in heroes. Heroes are mythical. People, anti-racist, educators like ourselves, we are flesh and blood. But nevertheless, the anti-racist journey is one that goes from the ordinary world, in this case, structural racism, into a special world, one of liberation and anti-racism. And again, we can illustrate this through a spiral model, which are popular in my fields. They represent cyclicity as well as growth. And in the research I've been doing with colleagues, we've been able to kind of outline a type of progression that we can see with regards to social consciousness development. We can see that given our upbringing in the United States, or whether we emigrated here, most of us are at this origin point, what's called stasis. And we remain in this place of stasis for a while until something happens, until a jarring event occurs that wakes us up. This jarring event can come in many forms. It can come in the form of an experience with personal discrimination, or maybe someone that we know, a peer, a loved one, had experienced discrimination. The jarring event can also happen at a societal level. Shocking events that shape the consciousness of the entire nation. For example, the murder of George Floyd. These jarring events create a psychological state of unease. And I think the initial response, the natural response, the understandable response, is to refuse the call. It's not easy leaving the safety of the status quo, especially if we have invested in it so much. But if we're open-minded to the process, we can meet more experienced others who can mentor us through this process of critical consciousness development. Critical mentors can walk us from awareness into that cave of deconstruction. And inside this cave is where we will learn the facts of our upbringing, of our socialization, and the truth about our society. We will learn about those who will be able to either help us along this journey, or those that may be detractors to our personal development. We are also in a place where we are going to likely face that thing that scares us the most. And I think that's best illustrated at the lowest moment of deconstruction at 6 o'clock. Because I think it's at this moment where we face the greatest fear, which is the shadow self. It is facing our complicity in a racial caste system that we didn't create, that we may not agree with, but that we are nevertheless a part of. Now, this is where most people stop because it becomes too painful to move forward. And it's at this point where it's much easier to revert into stasis. But if you're able to defeat that monster in the cave, you will be reborn. You will have a new way of looking at the world. You will come to understand the mythology of race and be able to reject that construct completely. You'll come to see the world through an anti-racist lens. And if fortunate, you'll emerge from that cave and return to the ordinary world. But now you're different. You are a master of two worlds. You remember what the status quo was like, but now you know the alternative. That is a powerful position to be in. It's a position that comes with a responsibility to have a public face, to educate others, to mentor others so that they can go on this journey as well. And this process repeats itself over and over within ourselves, between individuals, across time. And if we're successful through these processes, we can ascend to something better than where we currently are. Now, at this point, I would like to go in a different direction since we're halfway through this talk. And I'd like you to humor me. I want you to look at me as your mentor of sorts. As we close off this hour, I want to take you on a miniature version of the anti-racist journey, or at least partway. So we'll do a little bit of awareness raising and maybe even enter that cave for a moment. So as we do this, I want to give you your first tools on this journey, which are facts. So keep these two facts in mind. That prior to 1681, there was no concept of whiteness. But since then, white supremacy has been embedded in the United States legal system as a matter of law. Now, again, words and definitions are important. So before getting into this history, let's define what race actually is. So what is race, and has it always been around? Well, race is a categorizing system. It is a way of grouping human beings into categories on the basis of skin color. Now, keep in mind that people throughout human history have always been categorizing themselves and objects in their environment. It's part of our cognitive resources. It's one of the reasons that we as a species have been able to survive for so long. However, race is a relatively new idea in human history. Humans have not always been grouping themselves on the basis of skin color. And the word race actually is derived from a Portuguese term called casta, which means caste or hierarchy. It's a Renaissance era term that was used by the early Portuguese traders who entered into what is now modern day India. And these Portuguese traders, they used the term casta to refer to India's Varna system, which is basically the Hindu hierarchical system that's been in place for over 2 millennia. And while people have been categorizing themselves and their societies forever, again, this isn't done for its own sake. There is an intention behind the categorization process. And usually it's to determine who has access to power and resources. In the United States, race has always, and I want to emphasize that, it has always been used to organize our society. So historically, while hierarchy predates race, practically speaking, race is by definition hierarchical. It is meant to be unequal. It is meant to be unfair. And the United States is, by definition, a racial caste system. Isabel Wilkerson, who I consider to be one of the best authorities from a non-psychology perspective in the areas of hierarchy, she defines caste as the granting or withholding of respect, status, honor, attention, privileges, resources, benefit of the doubt, and human kindness to someone on the basis of their perceived rank or standing in the hierarchy. So now you can ask yourself the question, if race isn't a real thing, then has it always been around? Or I should say the other way, if race hasn't always been around, is race even a real thing? Well, that depends on your meaning of the word real in this context. Now, to be clear, race has no biological, scientific, or logical basis. Race is what's known as a social construct. And social constructs are simply ideas that were made up by a bunch of human beings that ended up getting accepted by the majority of the society. You'll see that race is an idea that began in colonial times, but it persists today, especially in the United States legal system. Words and discourse drive this social construction process, and law is a primary example of the power of words and discourse. Now, I want to talk about 5 points in legal history, not because these are the only events to talk about. The nuances of this history are very, very complex. But these 5 points do illustrate a very, very important argument. Let's begin in the colonial period in 1614. In the Massachusetts, Maryland, and Virginia colonies, which are owned by England, the primary industry at this time is tobacco farming. It's an agrarian society. As a result, the ratio of men to women in these colonies are heavily skewed towards men. Depending in which colony you were in, or at which period of time you were in one of these colonies, the ratios from men to women can be anywhere between 10 to 1 to 12 to 1. And most of these men and women were either indentured servants or they were enslaved people. Now, during this time, which was before chattel slavery, which was the cruelest form of slavery that has ever been enacted on planet Earth, in theory, indentured servants and enslaved people could gain free person status. Indentured servants can work themselves out of servitude, and when the masters of slaves passed away, that sometimes led to the emancipation of the slave. And these free persons were now considered, quote, equal under the law. This is important because the colonies during this period, they are borrowing a lot from British legal systems. It's the idea of British common law. One law that they borrowed in particular is this idea of the law of coverture, which basically says that marriage makes man and woman one, and the one is always the man. So the law of coverture is intended to create a patriarchal structure that's based off of legal marriage. And you started to see some of the first laws being enacted to create this structure. These laws are called anti-miscegenation laws. And they, in essence, punish what we, in our present day, consider interracial relationships or sexuality. In the Massachusetts colony, these laws punish what are called freeborn English women who marry Negro men. Now, this law backfires because it actually creates an incentive structure among the slave owners to encourage this behavior. in essence, is producing a free labor class because people who break this law lose their free person status. If you're an indentured English woman, you are reduced back to indentured servitude. And if you're a Black person who was freed, you are now reduced back into slavery. Now let's move into the next period in history, about 75 years later. And all the problems I've discussed have only gotten worse. And there's been so much discontent that this actually leads to a revolt known as Bacon's Rebellion that lasts for about a year and a half. This revolt was done through the solidarity between discontented enslaved Black people and indentured whites who were not calling themselves Black or white at this time because that terminology simply didn't exist. This rebellion was the first threat to capitalism, and it frightened the aristocracy so much that they actually wrote back to the British king, and they said that they are going to enact a divide and conquer strategy through their legal system. The way this was accomplished was through these anti-miscegenation laws. And so by 1681, you started to see the laws being changed a little bit. Rather than punishing English people, it would now punish white people who married either Black people or Native people. And it also punished slave owners or religious or civil leaders who encouraged these interracial relationships. Virginia took it a step further and it punished not just women, but all people. But of course, when the laws were enforced, when men broke this law, it was almost rarely, if ever, enforced. The importance of these laws, though, is the fact that this is the first time that the word white appears in the legal lexicon. And this would eventually impact the political lexicon, which would then eventually impact the broader social and cultural lexicon. Now, some of you are probably picking up on something else that's going on here besides racism. What you're seeing through these laws is that these laws are trying to control the relationality and sexuality of white women who are in short supply and their relationality with non-white men. In essence, these laws are trying to tie white women's access to power through marriage to white men only. It is a process to create a legalized patriarchal structure where men who are white can do whatever they want to their wives or children so long as it's under the guise of protecting the family. This philosophy persisted throughout the colonial period and well into the United States culture. In fact, the very first law that the United States passed was the 1790 naturalization law that limited citizenship to whites only. But I want to talk about a law that happened 200 years later, or I should say 100 years later. In 1896, we had the Plessy v. Ferguson decision done by the Supreme Court, which basically said that separate but equal is constitutional. It, in essence, created legalized apartheid for about a period of 58 years. And this period, we had a cascade of laws where citizenship was denied to non-whites. The ability to vote or run for office was denied to non-whites. And there were even alien land laws, which made it punishable for non-whites to own land. This persisted until 1954 when the Supreme Court came in again through Brown v. Board and basically said that Plessy violates the 14th Amendment. It violates the Equal Protection Clause, and separate but equal is unconstitutional. However, just because you change laws doesn't mean that the culture changes immediately. And in fact, the federal government had to come in about 10 years later and enact another law that outlawed discrimination on the basis of race and color and religion. Of course, though, these forms of discrimination still persist in the form of the war on drugs, the prison industrial complex, or what Michelle Alexander refers to as the new Jim Crow. So taken together, we come to an uncomfortable reality that in the United States, white supremacy is legal. It is by design. However, systems do not change until we acknowledge this uncomfortable but very true reality. So let's consider how this history has impacted our modern day systems and institutions, especially in education. I'm sorry, I'm having some slide issues here. Okay, sorry. So systemic racism is not the same as individual discrimination. Systemic racism is the use of laws, policies, regulations for the purposes of maintaining a racial caste system. For many years, the government did this through practices known as redlining, where banks and insurance companies would take maps and basically draw up places that were considered desirable regions and therefore for whites only, and geographic regions that were considered undesirable and therefore for non-whites. Banks and insurance companies would use these maps in order to deny people of color mortgages as well as insurance coverages. You can see that these laws were being enacted to limit the ability for people of color to develop what is called intergenerational wealth, the ability to pass on to your offspring the benefits that you have reaped. Education has been affected through these practices. Public schooling is, for the most part, funded through property taxes. And since Brown, we saw that even though discrimination in the public school system is illegal, it still happens in practice. We saw during this period white flight, where people left these mainly white neighborhoods as soon as people of color started to move in. And this reduced the property values of those areas, which then impacted the public schools in those regions. We also saw the growth of private schooling, which was something that was open very much so towards white people. And you started to see that educational resources were not given out equal, again, because everything is dependent on these property taxes. We can also see the impact of systemic racism in our economics. The top 10 richest Americans are all white. Today, African-American families on average have $5 of wealth for every $100 held by a white family. And redlining, while federally prohibited, still continues in other forms, like reverse redlining, or what's known as predatory lending. And we also see this bias in our government and politics. The racial makeup of our government has increased over the years, but nowhere near the representation of the general population. US Congress, 90% is still white. US governors, 96% are still white. Top military advisors, 99% are white. And as it concerns the presidency and the vice presidency, the only two exceptions we've had are Barack Obama and Kamala Harris. Now, at this point, some of you are probably wondering, like, what are you supposed to do with all of this information? What is the point? The enormity of historical and systemic injustice is enough to overwhelm or paralyze anybody. While I want to acknowledge those concerns, I think they're very legitimate. At the same time, as your unofficial anti-racist mentor, I would like to ask you to resist falling back into stasis. I ask that you embrace the interdependency between the individual and the society, that you reject that false duality, that you begin to locate yourself within these broader systems of injustice, that you begin to identify your spheres of influence so that you can pursue intentional long-term diversity, equity, and inclusion aims. Now, remember that the personal is sociological and the sociological is personal. In fact, this point was articulated by a well-known psychologist, Urie Bronfenbrenner. In the book, The Ecology of Human Development, he actually proposed a very simple, but at the time revolutionary idea. Keep in mind that prior to this time, the dominant view of human development was individualist and universalist, which again is code for white mainstream. It placed a heavy emphasis on biological and cognitive imperatives. And while those things are important, Bronfenbrenner proposed a different view. He argued for an ecological perspective and argued that individuals and their development, they are the result of proximal and distal environments. He called those environments ecosystems. And in fact, this idea of ecosystems can be easily illustrated through a series of concentric circles, no different than the figure you're looking at right now. And so you can see that the individual is their own biopsychological entity. They have their own sex, their own age, their own mental life. But the individual is not an island unto themselves. They exist with other individuals. But these individuals, they coexist in meaningful groups. We call those groups families, peers, churches. And these meaningful groups interact with each other in what's known as a mesosystem that's being impacted by our broader social structures, the services that are available in our society, educational systems, legal systems, transportation, the political systems that we have, the mass media that we consume, and of course, our very economic system, which in our case is capitalism. And all of these things inform the broader cultural ideologies. The idea of individualism and meritocracy and colorblindness all coexist within these ecosystems. So using this ecosystemic perspective, we can see how our institutional practices are shaped by, but also shape the personal and the sociological. In other words, racial biases at the individual level and systemic racism at the macro level work in tandem to produce racially biased or racist institutions. Now, of course, you don't have to take my word for this. You can simply look at the science and deduce the same conclusion. Now, consider the example of hiring practices. A very popular methodology in my field of work is what's known as the resume paradigm. This approach is very popular due largely to the simplicity of the setup and the easily understandable logic. Now, typically in these randomized experimental studies, fictitious resumes are created and they are sent off to actual employers. And these resumes are perfectly identical in every way in terms of education, relevant experience, additional experience, project experience, community service, skills, etc. The only difference between these resumes are one or two demographic characteristics. And what these studies have shown consistently, and these studies have been happening since the 1990s, is that the pattern is unchanged. If you are in a minoritized group, meaning if you are a Black person, or if you are a woman, or if you are a woman of color, oftentimes in these studies, you are seen as less competent, less intelligent, less legitimate, and less hireable than your dominant group counterparts. And this pattern has been observed in settings outside of the resume study. It's been observed in media stories. It's been observed in court documents. It's even been observed in dating profiles and in real world situations where actors are put in place to see how naive participants behave in a natural setting. The ubiquity and perniciousness of systemic racism is scientifically undeniable. So, what are your spheres of influence and how are you leveraging them in order to create an authentic culture that is open to diversity, equity, and inclusion? I would argue that something that can help you along the way is to create a logic model, to identify the problem in your institution that you wish to correct. This may be a lack of education in areas around anti-racism. It could be color blindness in your student-teacher interactions, or maybe even in your hiring practices. The important thing is to acknowledge these issues and to bring in experts who can help you come up with a plan to achieve these goals. Additionally, I recommend being very vigilant about the heroes and holidays approach. One way that you can avoid falling into this pitfall is to continue having authentic conversations about racial bias and systemic racism. Don't let this 1 hour be the only time you have this conversation. As individuals, you can also elevate your own awareness by becoming aware of your own biases through self-education. And as an organization, you can ask yourself those same questions. What discourses are you engaging in that keep the inequitable systems in place? What are your college's spheres of influence? Now, as a member of the Equitable Calculus for Life Sciences team, I was asked to come here today to engage in an important conversation with you. And for those of you who are interested in digging deeper into these themes, our team will be hosting a 4-part workshop series in late July through August that will delve deeper into these concepts, but more in the context of critical pedagogy. So in closing, today, all that I've done is simply try to promote a reality that does not yet exist. It's an apology in favor of authentic DEI work that's desperately needed. So knowing the power of words, I put them together and tried to inform as well as inspire. Of course, this would be ideal. Realistically, though, the most that I can truly accomplish in this one address is to elevate the awareness as it concerns these historical events and the dominant discourses that maintain the status quo. I provided comprehensive definitions about racism. But again, I will reiterate that comprehensive definitions alone do not change systems or culture. So as we reach the end of today's journey, I will leave you with this. Humanity and our world are in peril. Injustices continue to run rampant. Hopelessness and indifference have become normalized. The world is crying out for an anti-racist. In this ongoing epic story called The Human Condition, what chapters will you write next? What roles will you play? What will you do for humanity and the world? You have been called to the anti-racist journey. Will you answer the call? Thank you. I know that we're past the hour, but for those of you that can stay, if you'd be interested in having a chat, or I usually do a little Q&A, I'm happy to take any questions right now.
Thank you, Jose.
Jose, that was lovely. I mean,